Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the Enemy in the Shadows campaign for the Warhammer Fantasy RPG. Fourth edition of Warhammer Fantasy has gone back to this classic campaign, which I called in my review of it one of the two greatest role-playing campaigns of all time. And one of the nice things that they have done with it is for people like me who have already played through it, maybe more than once. I've played it once and I've run it once as a game master. They are adding new stuff. And one of the new stuff things they have added is this book, The Enemy in the Shadows Companion. Let me give a quick, actually, let you give them a quick overview of this neat thing that they've done in here. So one of the neat things that you get is intro and guest commentary stuff. And so the two original designers, which is Phil Gallagher and Graeme Davies, they both have a little essay here. And Graeme Davies, he's the the one that I got to meet at Gen Con and talk about this game a couple of years ago. As he describes it right here, write a bloodless Cthulhu adventure for Warhammer. And that's what Enemy in the Shadows is. When we think about Warhammer Fantasy, unless you've played the role-playing game before, you probably think about the miniatures game, assuming you are familiar with it at all. And the miniatures game is, soldiers on a table fighting in a big war. It is all about war. It is all about violence. It is all about, tactics. The role-playing game is not that. And the identity of the role-playing game was largely formed by the Enemy in the Shadows campaign, which was the very first adventure produced for it, or the large adventure. Basically, and you can go through and read this whole thing later, and I'll move it now so that you don't get distracted by it while I'm talking. But they, knew that they had this interesting world, the old world of Warhammer, and the Reichland Empire and all this stuff. They knew that that was really interesting. They knew that it would make a good role-playing setting, and they created a very good role-playing game based on it. And then they're like, well, we need something for these people to do. And so rather than go with a war, they went with what is essentially a very long, there's 4 parts, campaign in which you are uncovering this massive chaos cult inside the Empire that is trying to destroy it from within. Originally it was called The Enemy Within, and for 4th edition they're calling it The Enemy in Shadows. So, what does The Enemy in Shadows Companion add to your games? Well, first of all, there's a map of the Bear Belly, which is the little riverboat that you get to use. So, just like the basic campaign, there are grognard boxes here. And the grognard box says, you've run this before, here's a way to shake it up. Here's a neat little twist that you can throw in that your players, who may have also run this before, aren't expecting. And those are fun to have. There are adventure hooks all through this that say, hey, we're talking about this new thing, here's how you could include it in your game. And that might be a road marshal, or an outlaw on the river, or an aspect of city life, like the guilds. There's a section where it talks about guilds and it talks about strikes. How can you include a guild strike, a labor strike, in your game? Here you go. And then last of all is Shadowcast, which says these boxes suggest ways to use the NPCs in this book. The cast in the shadows. And so as you go through this, it is really what it is it is kind of equal parts extra information for the campaign and extra information just for the old world itself. And it goes into a ton of detail about things like outlaws and brigands and politics and cities. And so you can actually, and this is wonderful, you can get a ton of use out of this book even if you are not playing the Enemy in Shadows campaign. If you just want to learn more about the old world, this book has a ton of information for you, including just countless NPCs and all of this other stuff. Let's actually look at it. And it's going to include a lot of specifics that say, here's all this new information and here's how it relates to Enemy in the Shadows. But, if you just want to skip over these, Shadowcast and Grognard boxes and so on, the rest of the information is just straight up super useful no matter what story you're telling, your own campaign. If it's about the old world, then it's wonderful. So there's some Easter eggs for people like me who've played through this campaign a bunch of times and they're able to say, look, we added this extra thing in here. And then it talks about the Empire. This is where you get into the really good world information. How is the Empire set up? Who rules it? Well, there's the electoral counts who have the electoral provinces. And here's all of their names. And then, here's how it works and how everything is set up. And then there's more provinces. And then there's towns. How do the towns work? How does everyone rule everyone else? Who are the specific elector counts of every single province? All of this stuff. Here's where it talks about strikes. So, how do taxes work? How do laws work? There is just so much really great world info in here. Okay, so that's about the Empire. Then we get this section, which is awesome. This talks about roads and highways and how to travel around. It explains how coaching houses work, which is really good information. In fantasy role-playing games, we tend to just say, well, you stay at an inn. What does that mean? Why is the inn there? Who built it there? Who runs it? Who maintains it? Who keeps it safe? This book contains a ton of information about that. And then, of course, it gets into all of these things. If you have different horses, how do different kinds of horses work? What other things do they do? Then it has this gorgeous travel section. This is less robust, but honestly a little more smooth than the travel section in the One Ring role-playing game, which is my favorite travel rules I've ever seen. And so this one does a really good job of that, basically breaking travel down into 4 or 5 different sections. You decide how many stages there are, you figure out what the weather is going to be like, and then it has this really neat thing called travel endeavors, which is similar to the roles that people will take while traveling in the One Ring. So, are you going to be the guy who forages for food? Are you going to be the guy who knows the woods and is going to keep us out of the weather? Are you going to be the guy who keeps the watch? Or, there's lots of different things you can do. And everyone in the group gets to pick a thing, and everyone in the group rolls on their travel endeavor. And then based on how well you roll, there are encounters. And this is split into good encounters, meaningless encounters, neutral encounters, and then harmful encounters, which can be very bad. Very few of these encounters are straight up, you meet some orcs and they try to kill you. Because the game is trying to be more narrative than that. And in fact, it describes how random encounters, unless the GM is a really great improviser, most of the time what a random encounter does is it will just slow the story down. And so these are ways of making that story interesting while still leading towards the very specific conflicts that your game master is already planning on. So, really love this travel section. And it goes into big detail on how to ride, what happens if you get dragged by something. Really love all of this travel stuff, even mounted combat. Okay, then, since we're talking about travel, let's talk about road wardens. These are the people who keep the roads safe, and this is another thing that we don't tend to think of. I guess the best way to set this section up is that a lot of our preconceived notions about fantasy role-playing come from The Lord of the Rings, in which most of the land they travel through is just pure wilderness, right? Once the hobbits get past Bree, then there aren't really roads. Maybe there's a path, but it's not a maintained road that people travel on every day as they are carrying goods and materials from one city to another. Warhammer Fantasy is based essentially on medieval Germany, in which there is wilderness, yes, but there are also roads. There is traffic. It is a developed part of the world. And so you do have people who are guarding the roads, and you do have bandits who are waiting on the side of the roads for people to come by. This section begins what I consider the NPC section of the book. So it talks about road wardens and toll houses and all this kind of stuff. And then it's like, here, let's give you an example. There's Johan Henderson. There's Alienora Al Shortbottom. There's whatever this dude's name is. There's all of these people who are specific road wardens you can meet, and examples of the kind of road wardens you can create up. Then it gets to a chapter about Bogenhofen, which is where the first part of the 4 parts of the campaign takes place, or eventually takes place. And what is it like to travel to Bogenhofen? Who are you going to meet along the way? And so again, more NPCs. Here are people, bounty hunters. Here are people who play in the fair. Here are gamblers. Here are charlatans. There's highwaymen. There's nobles. There's robbers. There's all of these really cool NPCs with really interesting backstories, and most of them come with specific notes of how you are going to actually include them in your game. And so, I mean, this is 2 steps above a lot of role-playing supplements, because A, it's not just, here's this, generic stats for a bandit. It's a very specific bandit with a name and a history. And B, there's notes on how you can include them in your game. So it's not just, oh yeah, maybe your characters need to get roughed up by a bandit. No, what is this bandit going to do? Why is this bandit going to do it? It's really, really neat stuff. So let's go through. And then once we get into town itself, who are the artisans that run the town? Who are the people, what are they doing? There's beggars. There's the Grouch Markin, who looks exactly like Groucho Marx. All of these neat NPCs. I just love this entire section. It is so valuable to me. Then, next chapter talks about mutants. Mutants are a very common thing in games about Warhammer, which is not to say that mutants themselves are common in the old world, but they are not rare. You are likely to run across them. This talks about what they are like, how they act, do they stay off by themselves, do they join cults, and then it has this wonderful section, tons of tables, on how to create them. There's an entire table on, if you have a beast head, which beast's head is it, and what powers does that give you? Huge section on physical mutations, huge section on mental mutations. I absolutely love this entire thing. And then, of course, at the end, we get into the Purple Hand, which is, spoiler warning, one of the primary antagonists of the campaign. Which is not really a spoiler, because I told you that the entire campaign is about a chaos cult that is trying to destroy the Empire from within. And so we get to learn so much about the Purple Hand in here, and who they are, and what they do, and how they do it. Give us some stats for their bosses. Give us all these other things. It is so neat and so complete. Here's all these monsters you can deal with, and then here's a bunch more people that you can interact with on the road. And then there's actually another adventure at the back of the book, just in case you didn't think there was enough information. This book is packed with content, and all of that content is good. And there's not a lot of books you can say that about. There's always going to be something that maybe isn't useful, or that they just were putting in there to fill up space. Not so in this book. Everything in it is great. And like I said in the beginning, everything in it is great, even if you are not going to play through the Enemy in Shadows campaign. So, this is a wonderful book. I think you should definitely play the Enemy in Shadows campaign, because, like I said, it's one of the 2 greatest role-playing campaigns ever created. And if you do decide to play through it, even if you haven't played through it before and you don't need those extra grognard boxes, you can still get just immense value out of this book and all of the extra material and the extra backstory and the extra threats that it throws in there. So, hooray for this wonderful book. Check it out, and I will see you on my next review.